All right, hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are covering lab lesson number 6. This is about the skeletal system. When we talk about the skeletal system, there are multiple types of tissues that we find in the skeletal system. So we'll do a little bit of histology tissue review here when we're looking at the stuff to get us started for today. So let me get my pointer. Let's start with my tissue down here on the bottom, because we're going to spend a lot of time looking at this tissue during our class today. Can anyone tell me in the chat? I know it's a lot to type. You can type me abbreviations or a shortened part. What kind of tissue are we seeing here on the left? What kind of tissue is this one here with these big black spots and these little tree rings? That was the way that we recognized it. I have a comment from Lisa that she can't see it. If you're having trouble seeing, maybe leave the meeting and come back. It should have progressed to the next slide. It's possible that it froze. Okay, so I've got a few more people that are able to see the slide now. That's perfect. And I'm starting to get some votes as to what my tissue is. So we are correct that the kind of tissue that we see down here on the bottom left of my screen, this is compact bone connective tissue. You recognize compact bone because of those dark spots that we're going to talk about here in a moment, and those tree rings that we see around those dark spots. So this is my compact bone. Hey, let's make it easy so you don't have to type everything. This is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, 5, and 6. We've already decided number 4 is compact bone. I also have a picture of spongy bone up here. Can you use my numbering system? And I'll try to write down there. Can you tell me which number represents spongy bone? Which of these is spongy bone? Save you a little bit of typing there. Just give me a number. Yes, yeah, several of us are correctly identifying when I look at these pictures of tissue here, spongy bone is tissue number 2. The way that you can identify spongy bone is that we've got this solid pink tissue that is the bone tissue. And then in between the solid pink tissue are these areas here with red or sometimes purple spots in them. That's the open space in spongy bone. So your bone tissue made out of compact bone, number 4, spongy bone, number 2. Your bone tissue starts as hyaline cartilage. In fetal development, the skeleton is hyaline cartilage. Which of my numbers that you see here on the screen represents hyaline cartilage? 1 through 6. Which one of those is hyaline cartilage? Exactly. Yep. Lots of us are remembering that number 3 right here. This is my hyaline cartilage. Remember that when you're looking at hyaline cartilage, you see the deer tracks, so the groups of 2 cells together, and you see the light pink background on it. So that's hyaline cartilage up there at number 3. The other kind of cartilage that's directly in the skeletal system is fibrocartilage. What picture shows me fibrocartilage? The other kind of cartilage that's really important in the skeleton. Yeah, several of us chatting in. Fibrocartilage is tissue number 1. Fibrocartilage, the way you're going to recognize that is its color. So remember that with fibrocartilage, we always have these blue fibers that we see here. And then a lot of times you're going to see these bright magenta or almost purple cells. Fibrocartilage, connective tissue. I have one more type of cartilage that's up here on the slide. That's number 5. Tissue number 5 is another kind of cartilage. It's the purple kind of cartilage. Do we remember what we always should be thinking when we see purple? What do we think when we see purple on a slide? Yeah, my friends who are fast typers are like, I got this, Dr. Ellis, I can keep up. For my friends that are a little bit slower, that's totally fine. No judgment. I know it's hard to type some of these words. So yeah, we are looking at number 5, elastic cartilage. We know that it's elastic cartilage because elastic is purple. So all the purple lines, all the purple stuff we see inside this area, that's elastic proteins. And then these big pink and white spots that we see here, those big pink and white spots are chondrocytes. They're cartilage cells. I threw on one other type of tissue here, not because it's part of the skeleton, but because I thought it looked kind of similar to my spongy bone up here. What kind of tissue can we tell? What kind of tissue is number 6? Any ideas what we're looking at there with number 6? Like I said, I kind of thought that it looked like spongy bone, so I threw it up there just to review. Yeah, so several of us typing. This is a type of epithelial tissue. I know that because I've got a bunch of cells. That's the pink things with the purple spots. I also see some open space, some white space. So tissue number 6 is simple squamous epithelium. We see that in the lungs. So these big open spaces that we see here, that's where you would find oxygen inside your lungs. So we don't have simple squamous epithelium in the skeleton. It's not related to that, but I did want to throw it up there to remind you that that midterm exam is coming up soon and all of the tissue types are fair game. About 1/3 of the exam is going to be identifying types of tissues, going to be saying where they're found or what they do. Make sure to take advantage of the review assignment directly related to histology to help you out with practicing these things for the exam. You'll see multiple pictures of different types of tissue. Make sure we're good at picking out those specific parts of them. So a little bit of histology review to get us ready for next week. Excuse me. Let's chat in particular about the 2 main types of tissue that we find in the skeletal system. So at the bottom of the first page of your lab packet, you have a space to draw the 2 types of bone tissue. So let's start with the type of tissue I see over here on the left. Is this a picture of compact bone or spongy bone? Which one do we see on the left? Compact bone or spongy bone? Can we tell? Several of us accurately identifying. We are looking at compact bone over here. So draw yourself a quick sketch of compact bone because we this week are not just identifying that it's compact bone, we're also looking at some of the important anatomical features that are in it. So let's talk about some of those features as you're drawing yourself that quick sketch. The first thing we always notice with compact bone tissue are these big dark spots. So these big dark spots are things called central canals. Central canals. I'm abbreviating, but I'll type here in the chat its full name. A central canal, when you're looking at a slide, is the part of the slide where there used to be blood vessels. So there used to be an open space here in this area called the central canal. Now that we've prepared a slide, the blood vessels are gone and we just kind of have this dark open space. So the central canal, all of those big dots that you see on compact bone. Surrounding those big dots are these smaller dots that we see them all over the place. There's all kinds of smaller dots. All of these smaller dots are things called lacuna. Lacuna. And when you hear the word lacuna, I want you to be thinking of it as a home or as a space for my bone cells to live in. Compact bone tissue is entirely filled with stuff. There's a lot of calcium, there's a lot of collagen, but I have these special lacuna, these special homes where my bone cells live inside of that aren't filled with collagen and calcium. So the lacuna are all of the little black spots that we see in this tissue. The other thing we can see when we look up close at this tissue are all of these little wiggly lines, kind of look like spider webs. All of these little spider webs that we see all over the place, these are things called canaliculi. I'm gonna type that because I'm not gonna be able to write it. Canaliculi, little central canals, if you will. Canaliculi are the little tubes that connect one lacuna to another, or that connect each of my lacuna to the central canal. The central canal has the nutrients, it has the oxygen, so we need to get that out to my cells who live all the way back here. Just because I live far away doesn't mean I don't need oxygen or nutrients. The canaliculi help me to get oxygen and nutrients to the central canal. So the last thing for us to label on this slide are all of these little spider webs that we see, little canals that allow these cells to get oxygen and nutrients, allow them to communicate with each other. It's their connection to each other. So I see that Lisa is mentioning with Latin, the word lacuna, that it relates to something that's missing. I think that's, if I'm interpreting your comment correctly. Yeah, a lot of these words have links back to Latin or back to Greek. So when we talk about a lacuna, we're talking about the part where there's missing bone tissue. There's not bone tissue, there's just these little, or excuse me, they're not bone tissue, there's just space for the cells to live in. So I like that, a little missing place where bones can live. That's perfect. All right, so we've got compact bone tissue on the left. Over here on the right, we're looking at spongy bone tissue. When we talk about spongy bone tissue, the good news is there's not as much to label. Just two things. So the first thing to label are these big pink things. So the big solid pink, that's all of this stuff here that I'm coloring and making ugly. All of the solid pink stuff here, these are things called trabeculae. And I'll type their whole name in the chat here, trabeculae. Trabeculae is another Latin word. It means beams. So spongy bone tissue is not completely filled in with bone like compact bone is. Spongy bone tissue, I think we talked about this in lab. Imagine curling up your fingers and curling up your fingers. That's how spongy bone works. If we slice straight through, you get the weird things we see with spongy bone. So the bone part of spongy bone is called trabeculae, little beams. The rest of what we see, so the spaces here where we see the pink dots on this slide, or where you sometimes see purple dots on other slides, this is where we see that bone marrow. So because it is spongy bone, it has space to hold bone marrow. We have bone marrow inside the spongy bone. We don't have it in compact bone, only in spongy bone. I'll mention, by the way, that when you look at spongy bone tissue, we do also see lacuna in spongy bone. We're not going to make you label them on the homework or on the exam, but I'll point it out because we are going to mention this in lecture. These little spots that I see right here, down here, all of those little spots are lacuna. They're homes or empty spaces for the bone cells to live inside of. By the way, I don't think I asked you this yet. Does anyone remember the name of the specific kind of cells that live in bone tissue? What's the name of the specific kind of cells that are only found in bone tissue? Yeah, I'm making you type today, aren't I? The specific kind of cells in bone tissue are called osteocytes. Osteo means bone. So when we look at these lacuna, when we look at these homes, that's where I find the osteocytes. That's where I find the bone cells. If you're good on histology, what we just talked about here, can you give me a thumbs up or give me a smiley face? Want to make sure we are set before we move on to our next part of the lab packet. Getting some smiles, good. Awesome. Okay. We're looking like we're mostly okay with that. So I will take it. I like it. So what we're going to do then, since we've talked about compact bone and spongy bone on slides, is now we're going to look at compact bone on a model. So what you see on the next page of your packet is a model of compact bone that looks a lot like the model, or just like the slide we just labeled. So as I'm looking here at this model, I can see some of the same things I saw before. So let's start with these spaces right here. So see on here, I've got these white spaces that have a red and a blue inside of them, and a red and a blue inside of them. We labeled a structure on our slide of bone tissue that we talked about had the oxygen and the nutrients for my bone tissue, or it had the blood vessels for the bone tissue. Does anyone remember what we called those black spots that we saw on our compact bone slide, the big ones, the big black spots? Yeah, a couple of us are still at our computers. A couple of us are correct, saying that these are the central canals. The central canals are the middle part of our bones. Let me bounce back. The big black dark spot that we labeled, the central canal. The central canal is where we find blood vessels, which when we're preparing a bone tissue slide, we don't have any blood vessels left. On my bone tissue model, though, I do see blood vessels. So in the middle of all of these tree ring patterns, we're seeing those central canals. Central canals. We've got them all over the place. Any of the areas where you see those blood vessels, we call those central canals. We also have, so Lisa asked a follow-up question, the blue and the red spots, what they represent. Did anyone catch that when I was talking about it before? What are these blue and red things that we see in here? Did anyone catch it? They're things that are missing from our slide, but they are present in real bone tissue. Yeah, exactly. A couple of us are chiming in. The red and the blue spots are representing arteries and veins. So it's representing the blood supply to the bone tissue, arteries and veins. So we labeled the central canals last time, which we just found here. We also labeled the lacuna. We also labeled the little homes. Now I'll mention for you that there are lacuna all over the place on this model. Anywhere where you see one of these little beige spots, all of these little beige spots are lacuna. All of them are places where we would find those osteocytes. So you can label lacuna anywhere. Wherever you see a little brown spot, that is a lacuna. What we can tell from this model, and what we saw on the bone tissue as well, though we didn't ask you to label it, are the way that our lacuna like to arrange themselves. So you know how our houses or our apartments are arranged along streets? Well, when we talk about the way that lacuna arrange themselves in compact bone, we have a special word for it. It's called lamellae. So I put that in the chat. Lamellae are the lines that I arrange my bone cells in. So we have to get a little bit creative here to see them on our model. So see how I've got the spot here? I'm going to kind of make a little circle around my central canal. That's one lamella. And then I've got another line of cells that are right here. That's another lamella. Anywhere where we see these dark brown spots in a circle, those circles are lamellae. The circles are lamellae. So each of these circles that I'm seeing here that goes around the central canal, this is the kind called a concentric lamellae, or lamella technically is one. Concentric lamellae make circles. So when I have groups of cells that are going from the central canal out, 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 the tree ring pattern that we're looking for in compact bone, that's because of the concentric lamellae. I also put some cells in lines on the outside of my bone tissue. So when I put cells in lines on the outside of the bone tissue, I have a different name for those. Those are called circumferential lamellae. So I'm not going to write that whole word, but I will type it for you. Circumferential lamellae. Lines that are on the circumference or on the outside of my bone tissue. So see how we can see these lines of cells extending even beyond where we see it kind of going up. We have lines of cells on the outside, circumferential lamellae, circle lines of cells called concentric lamellae. When we have concentric lamellae, the cells that are in there need to get their oxygen and nutrients from somewhere. They get their oxygen and nutrients from the central canal. But if you live on the outside of the bone tissue, you're getting your oxygen and nutrients from this layer here on the outside called the periosteum. Periosteum. I'll type its whole name in the chat. Periosteum. This is the connective tissue on the outside of our bone. This connective tissue brings oxygen and nutrients to the circumferential lamellae, to the cells that live on the outside. The one other thing you need to label on this model is something called an osteon. And for us to label an osteon, I need to do a little bit of word math with you to help explain what an osteon is. So I'm going to type in the chat here. An osteon is made from a central canal plus all the concentric lamellae that are found around it. So an osteon is a central canal plus all these circle lines of cells that go around it. This is one osteon. But this is also an osteon. And this is also an osteon. So any place you see a central canal and lines of cells around it, the tree ring pattern, essentially, for compact bone, that's a thing called an osteon. Compact bone has a lot of osteons in it. How do we feel about the compact bone model from the top when we're looking down on it, when it's most similar to that slide that we looked at? Oh, friends. Cassidy's nodding her head. Cassidy's good. Y'all are getting a better class than my morning friends. My coffee has kicked in, so hopefully we're tracking with me. Good. Callie gave me a thumbs up. Thumbs up back at you. Love it. Okay. Well, now we're going to take this compact bone model, and instead of looking at it from the top, we are now going to look at it from the side. When we look at this model from the side, we can see a lot of the exact same things that we saw before. So let's start with our little brown spots. Got a whole bunch of these little brown spots again. When I talk about the little brown spots that I see here, what was the name of those things again? I know I'm making you type, not English. My little homes for bone cells. Yeah, these little homes for my bone cells, these are called lacuna. So again, any of those little brown spots, I got some over here, I got some all over the place. Anywhere with the brown spots, those are called lacuna. Another thing that we labeled on the other slide, or the other image, excuse me, we labeled these things. These were those places where I had the red and blue spots, where I had the blood vessels. What was the name again of the places in my bone where those blood vessels travel through? They looked black on my tissue slides. Exactly. Several of us correctly chiming in here. When we talk about these places where we go straight up and down, where the blood vessels are found, that's called the central canal. The central canal. Absolutely. If you notice, though, when we're looking at this model from the side, we can also see that there are some places where blood vessels go into or out of the bone tissue at an angle. So when we go into or out of the bone tissue at an angle, now we call these a perforating canal. A perforating canal. When we talk about perforating canals, these go across the bone tissue. So instead of going straight up and down like this one, these ones are going at an angle. They're helping us to bring blood in from that thing called the periosteum, that connective tissue on the outside, or they're helping us to share some of that blood in other places inside the bone tissue. So perforating canals at an angle, central canals straight up and down. And I'll mention that from this side view, you can also see this wedding cake thing over here. This is an osteon. So remember from our word math, right, that osteons were a central canal, which is in the very middle right here, and all those rows of cells that are found below it. So osteons, a central canal, and the concentric lamellae, or the circles that go around it. Were there any other things we needed to label on this view, or did we hit them all? I told my friends this morning I don't have my worksheet in front of me, so you're going to have to help me out. I think we got everything. Okay, I got a thumbs up from Callie, so I'm going to go with it. Perfect. So make sure you can recognize stuff on the bone model, and make sure that you can recognize stuff on the bone tissue as well on the slides. We're going to switch gears now from looking at the microanatomy of bones. Now we're going to look at bones big picture. So we're going to talk about the ways that we can classify the different bones in the body. So help me out in the chat. Where in your packet does it talk about things like long bones, short bones, irregular bones? Page 3, maybe? It's either 2 or 3, I think. Page 2. Okay, so we're on page 2. We are chatting about the structural classifications of bones in the body. So to do this, I'm going to use this image that we see of the hand. Not all of the types of bones in the body are seen in this picture, but several of them are. So we're going to use that. Let's start with one of the bones that we have in the palm of your hand. So this bone right here is a metacarpal bone. This bone is really tall and not very wide. If I have a bone that's really long, but not as wide, I call that a long bone. Long bones, they are taller than they are wide. Long bones, to some extent, are kind of like those columnar cells, right? Their description sounds a lot like columnar cells. So taller than I am wide, that is a long bone. Some of my bones are about as tall as they are wide. That's an example of a short bone. In your body, the two places that we find short bones are the carpals that I see here, and also the tarsals. When I talk about carpals, where in the body are carpals? If you were to give an easy description, where do I find the carpal region or the carpal bones? Yeah, exactly. The carpal bones are the ones here in your wrist that give you the incredible amount of movement that we can do. It's because we've got a bunch of little bones inside here. So the wrist, one of the places that I find short bones. The other place is in the tarsal region. Where is the tarsal region? That one's a little bit less well known, right? The tarsal region. Exactly. Yep. So the tarsal region is the ankle region. In the ankles and in the wrists, we find bones that are about as tall as they are wide. That's a short bone. Another kind of bone that we find in the body, we don't see it in this picture, but another type of bone we have in the body are called flat bones. Flat bones are bones that are really flat or they're really skinny. Oftentimes with these really skinny bones, because they're so thin, they'll actually curve at the edges. So a good example of a flat bone are the ribs that you have in your rib cage. They're very skinny and they curl at the two edges because they're so skinny. So no flat bones on my my picture here of the hand, but that would be things like I said, like the ribs, for example. We also have one more structural classification of bones, and these are bones that maybe part of them is long, part of them is short, part of them is flat. I can't classify them easily because they look so funky. Those are what we call irregular bones. So irregular bones, I can't classify them with any of these other markers that we talked about. I'm going to call those irregular. There's one other type of bone that we can classify things in the body, and it's not based on what it looks like. It's based on where it's found. So I want to show you in my picture right here, if you can see that little faint spot that's right there at the thumb joint. This is an example of what we call a sesamoid bone. So sesamoid bones are found embedded in tendons. Most of the sesamoid bones in your body are really, really small, and they're different from person to person. But there is one sesamoid bone that we all have, and this is the sesamoid bone that's found inside the patellar tendon. Any guesses what bone in your body is a sesamoid bone? Yeah, so it's the bone that makes up our kneecap, right? What's the name of that kneecap bone? Yeah, Callie's right. That kneecap bone, technical name, patella. The patella is the one sesamoid bone that everybody has that's entirely the same. We all have sesamoid bones. We have different numbers of sesamoid bones in different places, but usually where we find them would be the palms of the hands or the soles of the feet, because sesamoid bones develop from using something repeatedly. So I like to joke that this must be a picture of someone who's a professional gamer. They get paid to play video games all the time, constantly moving their thumbs, using that ligament that's inside there. We develop a little tiny bone in there. So any of your tendons and ligaments that get used a whole bunch, that move around a lot, you can develop these little sesamoid bones inside. So that's a description of the types of bone that we have in the body. Now we're going to work together on some examples of different bones from the body to help us apply these classification words. So let's go through. I'm going to change my pen color again. Let's start up here with the bone that we see here in the corner. Does anyone have a guess as to which bone we're looking at right here? What bone might this one be? I know, Dr. Allis makes you type a lot. Okay, so I'm getting several votes for the femur, which is actually incorrect. Oh no. Yeah, I'm getting a couple of votes for the humerus, and that is correct. And I'm going to teach you, this happens every semester, so don't feel bad if you're one of my femur friends, because I get that a lot. The way I know that this is the humerus and not the femur is because of this part right here. See how this part up here, this is what we call the head of the humerus. This is what goes into your shoulder joint. See how it's like attached to the bone? It's really close to the bone. When we look at the femur in just a little bit here, you'll see that the head actually sticks out from the bone. So if we see a bone that's shaped like this, that's really tall and long, and the head is directly attached, it's squeezed on there, That's the humerus. When we look at the humerus, which of those bone shape words would we use to classify the humerus? Is it a long bone, a short bone, a flat bone, irregular bone? What do we think? Alyssa said she was making sure I was paying attention to the chat by saying it was the femur. I like it. Yeah, so several of us are typing in when we look at the humerus. This is definitely a bone that is longer than it is wide. So the humerus is an example of a long bone. By the way, when I asked my morning class to classify this bone, they said, oh, it's an example of a funny bone. It's like, well, you're not wrong. But when we're talking structural classifications, we would call this a long bone. Another bone that we are classifying, this one that we see down here, this is called proximal phalanx number 4. Now, I'm not going to ask you for the sake of the midterm exam to know the specific name of each of these phalanges. We will have to know it when it comes time for the final exam, but I'll teach you really fast how they're named to help you with understanding or predicting these things. So when we talk about the phalanges, which is, let me get my pointer here. When we talk about the phalanges, that's these 3 bones that make up the fingers, or the thumb actually only has 2 phalanges on it. So all of these bones that we have out here are all called phalanges, which means I have to be specific and describe their locations. So some of my phalanges are here really close to the palm of the hand. Some of my phalanges are really far away from the palm of the hand. When I talk about the phalanges, would I say that these ones out here, would I say that these are proximal or distal? What would I say about these phalanges out here? Are they proximal or distal? Excuse me. Several of us chiming into the chat correctly. These ones that I see here on the ends, these are the distal phalanges. Remember that distal means farther away. The ones that are right here touching the palm of the hand, touching the metacarpals, are the proximal ones. And then every finger except the thumb also has middle phalanges too. So middle phalanges, distal and proximal. So we've got the part of the name that says proximal phalanx. And then number 4 comes from the fact that we count. So number 1 is the thumb, 2, 3, 4. Proximal phalanx number 4, if you're wearing a ring on your ring finger, this is the bone that it's on top of. When I look at proximal phalanx number 4, this bone right here, what is the structural classification of this one? Long bone, short bone, flat bone, irregular bone. What's my classification on this one? Look at you all. Dr. Ollis can't even trick you. Not all long bones in your body are super long, right? The humerus, very long bone. But bones like we have in our fingers as well, as long as they are longer than they are wide, they count as a long bone. So the phalanges in your fingers, the phalanges in your toes, all of those are long bones. They're longer than they are wide. Let's switch it up a little bit. Can anyone tell what bone this one is? It looks a little funky when it's by itself. Anyone have an idea of what bone we're looking at here? Yeah, so we're a little bit nervous about it because we're seeing it without its friends, right? The bone that we're looking at right here is the sternum. So the sternum is the bone in the center of the chest. The sternum is a bone that's considered a flat bone. It's a flat bone because if you looked at it in 3D, it'd be very skinny, flat bone. The other way that this fits the flat bone classification is your sternum actually curves down a little bit and it curves up a little bit, the sternum. And remember when we talked about flat bones, they curve a little bit. So the sternum, along with the ribs, good examples of flat bones. Hey, look, here's that bone that we were thinking about earlier. This bone is the femur. Again, remember I told you we look at this part that sticks out here, the head. See how the head on the femur is not directly attached to the rest of it compared to the head on the humerus. So here's my femur. The femur has the same classification as the humerus does. What would be my classification of the femur bone that I see here? What's the classification on the femur? Exactly. Yep. Several of us correctly chiming in. These are long bones. This is actually, the femur is actually the longest bone in the body. So femur, humerus, very typical long bones, but also bones like the radius and the ulna. Those are long bones too. The tibia and the fibula. And like we talked about before, all that stuff in the hands and the stuff in the toes as well, in the feet. This little guy is the patella. The patella is not very impressive when we don't see it inside a tendon, but can you remind me in the chat, what do we call bones that we name based on the fact that they're found inside tendons? What are those bones, those called? The ones inside tendons. Exactly. Yep, that's the ones with that weird name, right? The ones that are called the sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones inside tendons. The only one I'm going to ask you about, honestly, is the patella. That's the one sesamoid bone I'm going to ask you about. If you want a good example of an irregular bone, this is what we're looking at over here. This is a thoracic vertebra. So this is one of the bones that makes up your spine in the chest region, in the thoracic region. The reason I call this an irregular bone is because I have this section right here that's about as tall as it is wide. I've got this section down here that's pretty flat. I've got these sections up here that stick out and look all funky. I don't have one good way to classify this bone, and since it's not inside a tendon, my only option then is to call this an irregular bone. So this is an irregular bone. All of the vertebrae are irregular bones. And the last bone, I believe we were talking about, this is called the trapezoid. So the trapezoid is one of my carpal bones. When we talk about the carpal bones, and the tarsal bones for that matter, what was the structural classification for the carpals and the tarsals? Do we remember what we called those ones? The carpals and the tarsals. Yeah, several of us have typed in, several of us still typing in. When we talk about the wrist bones or the ankle bones, we're talking about very typical short bones. So short bones, the bones that we find in the wrist, the bones that we find in the ankle. Want to pause for a moment? Do we have any questions about the way that we classify bones in the body? Or if you're feeling good, shoot me an emoji. Let's see. Yes. An emoji like that one. For my friends on the recording, I just sent in a bone emoji. Happy to break that thing out. Love it. Oh, but here's the question. What would be the structural classification of the bone that we sent in that emoji that's just the bone? What would we say the classification is on that one? Yeah, exactly. Yep, the bone that I sent into the chat, that would be an example of a long bone. Absolutely. Hey, when we talk about long bones actually have particular regions So the next activity in your lab packet is helping you learn the names of the different regions of my long bones. So let me get out my pen again. When we talk about long bones, the first things that we need to know are what's called the shaft of the bone, the diaphysis, compared to the ends of the bone, the epiphyses. So the middle part of my bone, the shaft, is called the diaphysis. Goodness, my handwriting is terrible. So sorry. The shaft of the bone, called the diaphysis. The two ends of the bone, called the epiphyses. The epiphyses. Because we have two ends on this bone, we have to distinguish them from one another. So one of my ends is proximal, one of my ends is distal. When I am talking about the end up here that's going into my hip joint, would this be the proximal or the distal epiphysis? What word do you think we'd use for this end or this epiphysis? Yeah, so I've got a couple of us who've chimed in. This one up here is that proximal epiphysis. Remember that proximal means it's closer to the attachment site, which makes this one down here at the bottom the distal epiphysis because it's farther away from that attachment site. On the outside of a long bone, this is all we need to be able to label: the shaft and the proximal and distal epiphyses. When we go inside the bone, we need to be able to label a few more things. So one of the things we need to be able to label is the inside of the middle of this bone here. So the inside of the bone that we see right here, this is a part of the bone known as the medullary cavity. The medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is the part of your long bone where you store bone marrow. So if we were seeing this model in 3D in real life, you'd actually see an open space in the middle of the bone where that bone marrow is present. So the medullary cavity in the middle of the bone. Lining the outside of the bone on all sides, we find compact bone. So notice how, especially when we look here on the shaft, how you can see this solid part of bone at the top. That's the compact bone. Hey, is bone tissue number 1 or number 2? Which one of those is representing compact bone? Number 1 or number 2? Those tissue pictures we have. Which one's compact bone? We're a little bit divided. When we talk about these two types of bone tissue, this one has open spaces in it. With these open spaces here, that's going to make this my spongy bone. My compact bone is the one that I see over here. My entire field of view filled with bone tissue. And the thing that I can really tell makes it compact bone, these dark spots, my central canals, with the concentric lamellae around them, the lines around them. When you look at compact bone tissue, you see those osteons. That's what we called that, the dark spot with the circles around it, the osteons. So compact bone tissue is found on the outside of bones, making them really strong. When I look in places like I see up here, the epiphyses of my bones, lots of spongy bone in the epiphyses. So the proximal and the distal epiphyses both have a lot of spongy bone inside them. Remember, spongy bone has bone marrow, and the medullary cavity also has bone marrow. We feeling thumbs up about long bones? Or thumbs down? Alyssa's thumbs up. Perfect. Ooh, I even get a high five from Melissa. Love it. Thank you. Making my day. So Hayden's asking about the last area. So what I circled at the top and the bottom, these things was a type of bone tissue. Can anyone remind me in the chat, what kind of bone tissue did I find in the epiphyses? Yeah, Samantha like anticipated my question before I even asked it. Nice work. Yeah, I've got spongy bone in the epiphyses. So the proximal and the distal epiphysis, spongy bone. On the outside of the bone tissue, compact bone. Any other clarifying questions about this? Don't want to rush it too much. All right. I have one last learning activity for us to do together, and then I'm going to split us up for our group work. What we are getting ready to talk about is the last kind of question that you will see on the lab midterm exam. It's going to be questions where we ask you to predict the location of bone markings. This is gearing us up for the second half of the semester where we're going to spend a lot of time learning the specific locations of different bone markings on all the bones of the body. Right now, you know where the bones are found. You know the names of their regional terms. We know some of the words specific to long bones. But when we start looking at bones in the second half of the lab semester, you're going to start learning that all of the bumps and all of the indentations and everything like that has its own special fancy anatomy name. The goal of these last activities here on page 4 and page 5 is to get you ready to start learning all of the bone markings. I need everyone to write something down for me because it's really important that we all know this. On page 4, where you've got this picture and you've got this picture, I need you to write somewhere in big bold on that page. Do not memorize this. Do not memorize this. I promise you, on the midterm exam, I am not going to ask you, where do we find the greater trochanter? I'm not going to ask you that on the midterm exam. I'll ask you that on the final exam, but I'm not going to ask you that on the midterm exam. So when we're looking at this activity on page 4, the goal of the activity on page 4 is for us to start seeing some of those anatomy words and figuring out in normal person words, what do these words mean? Because see, flip with me to page 5, where you start to see this. Page 5 shows you what we need to do with these bone marking words. So all of the bone markings we're going to learn this semester fall into these 4 categories. Some of them mean some kind of hole. Some of them mean some kind of indentation. Some of them mean something that I find on the edge of my bone. And some of them mean some kind of projection, something that sticks up. What you need to know for the midterm exam is when I use one of these words, like tuberosity, you need to know that that means something that sticks up. Because anytime I use the word tuberosity, it always means something that sticks up. Or you need to know that when I use the word fissure, that means a hole, some kind of hole. Or when I use the word sulcus, that means an indentation. So we do have to memorize the stuff on page 5. We do not have to memorize the stuff on page 4. Let me work with you to help you figure out how you're going to fill in page 5, how we're going to use these pictures to do that. We're looking at, our first picture here is the femur. There are many specific bone markings on the femur that we'll have to know eventually. There's one that I mentioned a couple of times in class. Let's see if we caught it. Do we remember what the name of this part of the femur is? What was this part that sticks out on the femur? Did anyone happen to catch that? We have a list of options, by the way, over here. Yeah, Callie's right. This part over here is called the head of the femur. That's my technical name for it. The head of my femur is its technical name. If I go over here and look at my labeled picture where I've got easy words like English words, I can see that this word head means a projection. Now it's a projection at the top of the bone, but it's a projection. That's what I care about. So I'm going to go back to page 5. And on my list of things that mean a projection, I can now add the word head to this list. The head of the femur, the head of the humerus, the head of the radius. That's a projection at the top of a bone. I've added the word head to my list of things that stick out. So let's go back here. I also have these 2 pointy bone markings that I see right here. These pointy bone markings, if you use those resources in the guided lesson, we'll find out that this is the greater trochanter. I'm not going to write all of that. Greater trochanter. This one is the lesser trochanter. The lesser trochanter. Draw my arrow here. Notice that the meaning of greater trochanter is the larger bump, greater trochanter, or the lesser trochanter is the smaller bump. I'm going to go back now to my page 5. A bump is this part of my list here. So I can now add the word trochanter to my list of things that mean a bump or something that sticks out. So what we're doing is we're finding the technical name for these bone markings, then we're comparing that to the not technical name, to the regular person words, to help us figure out which list these goes on. Because this stuff here on page 5 is absolutely stuff for you to put on flashcards. A lot of anatomy stuff, not good for flashcards. This is good for flashcards. Front side of the flashcard says, which kind of bone marking is a tuberosity? Back side of the card says, a projection. Front side of the card, which kind of bone marking is a tubercle? Back side of the card, a projection. We do the same thing with these other lists. Which kind of bone marking is a fissure? Backside, it's a hole. We need to know these bone marking words in these groups, because when we take the midterm exam, I'm going to make you make some predictions. I'm going to tell you, hey, here's the name, here's the a picture of a bone that has a sulcus in it. Which of these bone markings is the sulcus? For you to be able to make that prediction, you need to know that a sulcus is an indentation. If I know that that's what that word means, I can figure out which of my things are indentations. So in a moment, I'm going to split us up into groups to do our group activity where you actually walk through one of these practice questions. For now, though, I want to finish up doing the femur with you. I'm going to leave the skull for you to do the labeling at home, but you'll do it the exact same way that we're doing it here in class. So let me go back to the femur. Let's finish up the femur together. We've already talked about the head at the top of the femur. We've talked about the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter. In between these 2 trochanters, we have this ridge right here. This ridge is called the intertrochanteric crest. The intertrochanteric crest. Notice that the word line is in bold on my easy words, and the word crest is in bold here. So when we're building the list of things that mean a line, that's one of the words that's going to go on there, a crest. When we go down to the bottom of the femur, what's going into the knee joint, we have these 2 big bumps that I see down here. These 2 big bumps are called condyles. When I talk about the condyles, if I told you that the head of the femur is what was pointing toward the middle of the body, would we say that the medial condyle would be number 1 or number 2? Let's take a guess. Would it be number 1 or number 2 that represents the medial condyle of the femur? Which one is pointing toward the middle? Number 1 or number 2? So we're like literally 50-50 split. When I talk about the way that the femur interacts with your pelvis, with your hip, this is, let me get my drawer back right here. This is where the socket would be for the hip. So this is the middle of my body, which means that my bump that's closer to the middle part of the body is the one that's over here. Number 1 would be my medial condyle because it's on the same side as the head. And the head is the part that goes toward the middle of the body. So my medial condyle is what I find here. My lateral condyle is what I find here, my lateral condyle. Notice that I also have things that are above these condyles called epicondyles. Epi means above. So if this is my medial condyle, do we think that this is the medial or lateral epicondyle? What do we think this one's going to be? We know it's an epicondyle. We got to pick the side. Yeah, exactly. Several of us chiming in. This would be the medial epicondyle, which would make this one the lateral epicondyle. Lateral epicondyle. The only thing left to label on the femur then is this indentation that we have here in the middle. This indentation is called the intercondylar fossa. Intercondylar fossa. Notice that the fossa word is in bold, as is the word indentation. So we skipped some things. Let's go back to page 5 with the rest of the stuff that we labeled. We labeled an indentation. That was our intercondylar fossa. Intercondylar fossa, an indentation. We labeled a line. When we talked about the line, that was a crest. And then we had those 2 bumps, right? We had the lower bumps that were called the condyles. And we had the higher bumps that are called the epicondyles. Epicondyles. So here's what I want to point out. We have not labeled the skull yet, and I'm going to leave that to you to do with your guided lesson or to do with Google Images. I don't care. We need to figure out which of those last words that are left is my last projection. We need to figure out which of those words from labeling the skull means some kind of hole or means something on the edge. Just like we did with all those things for the femur, you now need to do that for the skull to get these words sorted out. And remember, for the midterm exam, I need you to memorize these things, these groupings of words. I do not need you to memorize the things that are on the skull or the things that are on the femur. Please do not. That will be a waste of your time. And we only have so much headspace, right? We cannot waste headspace on stuff that won't be on the exam. And I'm promising you that these pictures will not be on the exam. But I will make you make predictions that are based on these words. So focus on the words to prepare you for that activity. As we're wrapping up what we're doing in class together, are there any last-minute questions? Yeah, so Lisa's asking about a foramen. We didn't cover that one together. So you'll want to use that skull activity to figure out which of those categories the word foramen goes into. There's several that we didn't do. Let's look at our list over here. We didn't do angle yet. We didn't do foramen. We didn't do meatus. We didn't do process. So those blanks you have left on your list, it's these 4 words. We got to figure out where those 4 words go to. And that skull labeling activity will help you with doing that. All right, well, I'm going to end our recording and we'll split up into those groups.